Hey guys, quick video to show you a few tips on how you can improve your clickers very easily for a little bit more polished result and a little bit more fun. Those three things are texture, animation, and sound. It's actually very easy to implement and we will see how we can do that. Before we jump to the code, we will talk briefly about tween versus animation player. Here I'm mostly talking about user interface. It might be different when you are dealing with 2D or 3D objects, but technically I guess they still apply as is. I'm gonna be honest with you here, I don't really know exactly in what situation you should be using tweens or you should be using animation player. I actually don't know animation player that much, and even tweens I often use them in a very basic way, so I don't really have enough background on this topic to guide you properly here. All I can say is that tweens are very easy to implement, and that's what we'll be doing today, tweens. For this episode, I will not pick the Crystal Idol game that we created in this series. I'm just gonna use an empty project to show you a few techniques that you can use, and you will be able to apply it to any kind of project you want, including the tutorial if it is what you want to be doing. We will be working with a simple control node, which will be the main container representing the game here. So the very first thing that we want to do is to actually create a texture button instead of a button. By default, the texture button is invisible because you have to set a texture for it. Here we're just going to use this texture from Godot, which is this little icon here, or if you actually want something different, I suggest you to go to a website that I will link in the description where you will be able to find a lot of icons. Just showing you very quickly what you have here, a lot of icons, a lot of categories, and a search bar. So for example, if you want, I don't know, you want a clicker that generates widths, you have access to this texture, you change the size, and you have it something like this. You change the color if you want, maybe a little circle around it. There's a few things you can do here, so just tinker with that. You may have noticed that the size of my button changed here. It took the size of the texture here. So it's okay because this texture is 128 if I remember correctly, but you can have very big textures and sometimes you want the button to be smaller or thing like this. So what you want to be doing is set the custom minimum size of your button to, let's say, 32 pixels, for example. And you want to ignore the texture size and change the stretch mode to scaling. Okay, so this way your texture will adapt to whatever size you give it. So very often when you're dealing with textures, you want to be tinkering with the stretch mode, and you often want to ignore the texture size if you, well, want to ignore the texture size. So anyway, I will be just removing all the things I said, and I'm gonna remove the custom minimum size and keep it to 128 at the moment. Okay, so that's for the texture bar. Now let's actually animate it. So as I said, I'm gonna be using tweens. In order to use tweens, you need a script, so I'm just gonna create a script on this button here. I'm creating the script on the bottom right. And I will create a first function, which I'm gonna name shrink. In this function, I will create a new variable, which is gonna be a tween. So by default, we want to create a tween, which can be done very easily by using create tween method. Here we have a tween. But what does it do? Well, basically it will do what we tell it to do. So you can, if you're courageous, go through the documentation, you will find very cool things, but I will try to explain it to you here. By default, the very easy way to think about tweens when you have no idea what they are basically helping you transition from a state A to a state B easily. In other words, you know the two endpoints, and the tween will be in charge of whatever is in between those 2 points, in order to make the animation a little bit more fluid and better looking in general, so that you don't have to take care and think about, okay, every frame I want to move the scale by, let's say, 0.003 per frame, because it will take 0.2 seconds. Yes, you don't think about that. Anyway, our tween is created, and what we want to do is to set a property for it. The tween properties are a list of actions that the tween will be executing. So here, for example, we're going to say tween, and we will take the tween property. We're going to use this method, and we will set the different arguments which will define what happens. So first we need a target. Here the target is the node itself, right? The script is extending the texture button, so it wants to modify itself. The next argument that we need to specify is the property that we want to change. In our situation here, we will make the button basically shrink and expand when we click on it. So we want to basically change the scale, okay? We can see that if we go in our transform, that we can change the scale to make it bigger, smaller, and with the tweens make this happen quickly, and to have this kind of, yes, bumping effect, sort of. So we want to modify the scale. The third argument is the final value. So I talked about two values, right? Point A to B. We're going to assume that point A is the current state of the object, but you can specify that you want it to start from a specific property value. That you can do with the from properties that you can find in the documentation. We're just not going to use this because in general, having the object tween from the current state is often going to be more fluid than jumping to some value and doing something. So here we want the final value, which is going to be a vector 2, right? Because the scale happens on both x and y. It's going to be a vector 2, which is going to be 0.95 on x and y. And the last argument is the duration. How long should it take to go from point A to B, which here is going to be 0.1 second. So in order to see this in action, we will actually connect our button to this tween so that when we click on the button, the tween activates. Here I just added the simple code that you use to connect a button. This is something that you should be familiar with. I'm not going to expand on that. But anyway, we can now run the scene, save it somewhere, and click on the button to see it shrinking. So we have two problems here. The first one is that the button doesn't expand back to make this bounce effect. And the second problem is that it is actually shrinking to its top left corner, right? It is not shrinking toward the center of the texture. In order to achieve this center thing here, we have to work with the pivot offset. This is going to define where the center of the animations are occurring. For example, when you have rotations, if you want this to rotate from the middle, yeah, you have to set the pivot to the middle. So here it's just the size, right? 128 divided by 2, which is 64. We just set 64 on both values, x and y, and there we go. It will now shrink toward the center and not the top left corner. The next step is to make it expand back. So I'm going to create a new method, which is going to be expand. Create another tween. And this other tween will be going toward a new value b, which is 1.05. So again, we set a tween property. affecting self, changing the scale, going toward the value 1.05 twice, and I want this to happen in 0.1 second. However, here we just expanded to make this bounce effect, but we need to go back to the scale of 1. We can achieve this by just adding another tween property, which will trigger after the first one is done tweening. So here again, self, we're gonna change the scale to a vector 2, 1, 1, and it's gonna take 0.1 seconds again. So now the question is, how exactly and when do we trigger this expand method? We could have it right after the first one, like this, but if we actually really look at it, we can see that it's not really shrinking, is it? It's actually expanding, but not shrinking. The reason for this is because the second tween is triggering pretty much at the same time as the first tween, and since it is the last one that was created and called, it most likely overrides everything that was said before. So what we want to do is actually wait for the first tween to be done before the second one can trigger. So we're going to use the keyword wait. Here we are doing asynchronous work. It can be a little bit complex, but when it comes to tweening, if you actually keep the structure fine, you should be able to understand and use this without any problem. But yeah, at some point you will want to search how to use wait in Godot in general. Anyway, we're gonna wait for the tween to actually be finished, because that tween will emit a signal when it is finished. And when it is the case, we actually want to expand at this moment. So what the code will do is that it will wait here before it goes to the next line. It will wait for the tween to be complete. So what it looks like now is that it will shrink and expand back. So we have a pretty good animation now. But there is one thing we can do to make it a little bit more interactive. Have the button shrink when we click and only expand when we release the click. This is something that we can't achieve with the pressed signal of a button, because basically the script doesn't have enough information here to make this happen. When does the player click? That's something which is not transferred in the press signal. The press signal is only emitted when you release the click. So you could be using button down, button up. That's the first way to work with that. Here, for example, I am changing the pressed connection so that we do connect on button down instead. And we can remove this await line in the first tween to create a second method, which is going to be on button up. And here we expand to actually purposefully override the other tween when we do click. Just connect it as well, button up, connect it to the right method, and we are ready to test this again. So we click the button and we do release, and it will bounce back. So it is a way to work with that. I will show you, for the purpose of showing you something which may be useful, we never know, I will show you a different way to catch the player input here. Because the button has those signals, it's very useful to make this animation. But you might actually need to catch the click on something which is not a button, which can happen, we never know. You can use a method, a built-in method in Godot and in control nodes to catch GUI events. So here we're just going to remove everything button related, and we're just going to create a function here, which is going to be the GUI input. This function basically will trigger the event occurring on this object, and we will want to do something based on what the event is. So we need to define what are the events. So by default, they are the mouse button events, but I usually prefer to work with the input map. So in the input map here, you can create a new action that you will name left click. You can add it and connect it to an action from the mouse, which is the left mouse button. This will allow us to catch this with the code, and this is going to be pretty useful. In our situation here, we're just going to check our event. We want to check that this event, which is an input event, we want to see if it is the action left click being pressed. We have a few things that we can use as arguments, but basically we just need this first check, right? We just want to see that it is pressed. And when that is the case, we do want to shrink. Now, when the event is actually released, and here left click, we actually want to expand. This will allow us to catch the left clicks on the button and do things accordingly, which are shrinking and expanding. There is another thing that we need to talk about, and it is the situation where your item is within a container. Let's create this simple situation. We have a vertical box which is at the center of the screen, and the button is within that vertical box. There we go. If we run the scene again, you will see that now the button is again twitching from the top left corner. This happens because if you go in the inspector, you will find out that the pivot offset is actually grayed out because it is supposed to be controlled by the VBox container. What it means is that we have to cheat a little bit, and we will just basically grab the focus when the button is created. When it is added to the tree, we will pick the pivot offset and change it to the size divided by 2 in order to move the pivot offset to the center of the texture, which will have this texture twitch from the center again. Now I'm going to show you a little technique which can be useful in some situations because here we don't have much containers and stuff to work with, but sometimes based on what properties you're working with, dealing with, you might end up having very weird behaviors with containers because containers adapt to their children, and because they adapt to their children, if you move the size of an item, it can get a little bit weird. So what you can do, let's say that you actually want your button or your texture or whatever to be animated, but you don't want its physical place to change, right? For example, you want your text, your label to grow a bit, but you don't want everything move itself to allow the label to grow bigger or something. I don't know. So I actually don't have this specific situation in mind right now, but what you want to be doing in this situation is creating a control node which will be responsible for taking the space of your object here. So you create a control node, you give it the size you want for the texture button here, so 128, and you set the texture button in it with a full rectangle so that it is properly stretching within this little control node. So think about this as the texture button physical space. And then the button, basically, you can move it around, right? You can pretty much move it around like this in your animation, have it, I don't know, wiggle like this, but it will not change its position. You can still see here that you have the physical space within the container. So it's not gonna mess with the container because there is this control node in between, which is kind of buffering this impact. Alright, the third point that I wanted to talk about in this video is a very quick one actually. It is sound. What you want to do basically is create an audio stream player. The first thing to do is to find sounds. So the most common website to find game sounds is Kenny's website. So I will link this in the description probably. And you can find a few audio packs that you can use. And yeah, that's great to make simple games, game jams. Check it out. For this example, I decided to pick 5 different sounds, which are the click sounds from the UI audio collections, if I remember correctly. And yeah, I had a little bit of rollback because my Godot basically crashed when I imported. All we have to do is to create an audio stream player again. And now we have this node in the inspector. The easiest way to have a sound, basically, I found is to have an audio stream randomizer. Okay, open it. Then you have the streams. You can add elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. And you bring all your sounds one by one so that you have 5 different sounds for your clicker. Okay, you might eventually want to increase the maximum polyphony of this audio to maybe 5. Assume that the player is going to click so fast that you have 5 sounds playing together well. Just if you do want sounds to overlap, that's something. And then all you have to do is to actually make it happen in a script. So here in our texture button, we can just fetch this left click being pressed, and when this happens, we start to shrink, and at the same time we can just grab the audio player, type it because we're not uncivilized people, as an audio stream player, I believe, and just use the play method. So this will allow the game to make a clicking sound when you actually click on it. And that's pretty much it. That's a very easy way to add a sound to a button. And we are actually done making this little tour about the 3 techniques you can use to make your clickers be a little bit more sexy. I hope you like this and that you will be creative and create cool things for your user interface, how eventually now you can start thinking about animating the user interface. Anyway, that's all I have to share with you today, and I will see you in the next video of your choice.